There is a tree that can grow up to 10 to 15 feet in a single year under the right conditions. Press its seeds, and you get oil that can be converted into biodiesel, capable of running diesel engines, even without major modification when blended properly. Drop those same seeds into contaminated water, and within 30 to 60 minutes, they can reduce up to 90 to 99% of bacteria by binding impurities and pulling them to the bottom. Eat the leaves, and you get one of the most nutrient-dense foods on Earth, rich in vitamin C, calcium, iron, and plant protein, especially when dried and concentrated. One tree. Fuel. Food, and water purification. For thousands of years, it quietly supported human survival. But what happened next didn't just change energy, it changed what the world was allowed to depend on. This tree is called Moringa. In ancient India, it was known as shigru, the tree that thrives where others fail. Around 2000 BCE, it grew in dry, unforgiving soil where conventional crops could not survive. People didn't just use it, they depended on it. The leaves were cooked like spinach, the pods eaten like beans, and the seeds pressed into oil for light and cooking. But its most critical use appeared during droughts. When wells turned muddy and unsafe, families crushed a few seeds into powder, mixed them into water, stirred, and waited. Within an hour, the dirt settled, and harmful bacteria were significantly reduced. The water became visibly clearer and safer to drink. They didn't understand the science. They didn't need to. It worked. And for generations, this simple knowledge quietly protected communities long before modern infrastructure ever reached them. As centuries passed, this tree didn't stay hidden. By around 600 BCE, early Ayurvedic practitioners were already documenting its use across hundreds of conditions, from inflammation to nutrient deficiencies. Traders carried it across regions, and its reputation spread. The Romans imported its oil from Egypt and India, valuing it for one unusual property: it resisted spoilage. In hot climates where most oils degraded quickly, Moringa oil remained stable, making it both rare and valuable. Across Africa's Sahel region, where droughts were relentless and soil was poor, Moringa quietly became a survival system. It grew where nothing else could, feeding communities when other crops failed. But the real shift came much later. In the 1800s, scientists began analyzing what ancient cultures had relied on for centuries. And what they discovered would turn this miracle tree from traditional knowledge into something far more disruptive. In the late 1800s, researchers began breaking down Moringa scientifically, and the results were hard to ignore. Every part of the tree had measurable value. The leaves, when dried, showed exceptionally high nutrient density, containing significant amounts of calcium, iron, protein, and essential vitamins in a relatively small serving. Even today, small daily portions are used in many regions as a low-cost nutritional supplement. The seeds revealed something equally important. They contained roughly 38 to 40% oil by weight, with a composition rich in oleic acid, similar to olive oil. This made it stable, clean-burning, and suitable for multiple uses, from cooking to lubrication. But one detail stood out above everything else. When properly processed, this oil could be used as fuel. Not just for lamps, but for engines. And at the time, the world was just beginning to build those engines. At the turn of the 20th century, engines were still new, and their future wasn't locked to petroleum. At the 1900 Paris exhibition, Rudolf Diesel demonstrated his engine running on peanut oil, not fossil fuel. He believed farmers could grow their own energy. In his writings, he predicted that vegetable oils might one day rival petroleum. Researchers began testing alternatives. Oils from crops like sunflower, cottonseed, and even moringa showed potential. The idea was simple: energy could be grown, not drilled. Then in 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, designed to run on gasoline or ethanol made from plants like corn or hemp. He envisioned a decentralized system where fuel came from farms, not refineries. Two paths were possible, one built on local abundance, the other on centralized control. What followed would decide which future the world would adopt. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, and within a decade, it dominated nearly 90% of oil refining in the United States. But this wasn't just about selling fuel. It was about building a system that made oil unavoidable. Pipelines stretched across states, refineries scaled production, and distribution networks placed fuel within reach of every growing city. As electricity began replacing kerosene lamps, a new opportunity emerged. Gasoline, once a byproduct, became the future. The rise of automobiles aligned perfectly with this shift, locking transportation into petroleum. At the same time, alternative fuels didn't scale at the same pace. Infrastructure, investment, and policy increasingly favored oil-based systems. By the early 20th century, the direction was set. Not necessarily by one decision, but by a system that made one path far easier to follow than the others. After Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, influence didn't disappear, it evolved. In 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation was established, funding universities, scientific research, and large-scale agricultural programs. The mission was to advance knowledge and improve food production, but the methods introduced a new model of farming. Mechanization began replacing traditional systems. Tractors took the place of animal labor. Synthetic fertilizers, often derived from natural gas, boosted yields quickly. Chemical pesticides reduced crop loss. And diesel-powered irrigation expanded farming into new regions. These innovations increased production, but they also increased dependency. Farmers now relied on external inputs, fuel, chemicals, and machinery. At the same time, older systems, diverse, low-input, and often tree-based, were gradually set aside. Not because they stopped working, but because the new system scaled faster under industrial conditions. And once adopted at scale, it became difficult to reverse. By the 1920s, the shift was visible. In earlier years, fuels like ethanol were available in some regions, produced locally from crops. But as petroleum infrastructure expanded, refineries, pipelines, and fueling stations, gasoline became the standard. Engines, supply chains, and policies gradually aligned around it. Alternative fuels didn't disappear overnight, but they lost momentum. Research focus narrowed, and large-scale investment flowed toward oil-based systems that were easier to distribute and control at national levels. Around this time, Rudolf Diesel died in 1913 under unclear circumstances while traveling across the English Channel. His vision of plant-based fuels didn't vanish, but it didn't dominate either. By the 1930s, petroleum had become the default. Not necessarily because it was the only option, but because it was the one the system was built around. By the mid-20th century, this model expanded globally. In 1943, agricultural programs supported by the Rockefeller Foundation began introducing high-yield crop systems in countries like Mexico. The results were immediate: higher production, faster growth, and improved food supply in the short term. But these new seeds came with conditions. They performed best with synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, and controlled irrigation, most of which depended on fossil fuels. Over the following decades, this approach spread across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Governments adopted it to meet rising food demands. Yields increased, but so did reliance on external inputs. Soil quality declined in some regions, costs rose, and traditional farming systems were gradually replaced. Practices that once relied on local resilience, diverse crops, natural cycles, and trees like Moringa were often labeled outdated. And once replaced, rebuilding those systems became far more difficult than abandoning them. Despite being overlooked at scale, research on Moringa never fully stopped. In the 1990s and 2000s, multiple studies revisited its properties with modern methods. Scientists confirmed that crushed Moringa seeds contain natural proteins that act as coagulants, binding to bacteria and suspended particles, causing them to clump together and settle. This is why simple seed powder can significantly improve water clarity and reduce contamination. Health organizations and universities also analyzed its nutritional profile in detail. Dried Moringa leaves were found to contain high levels of protein, calcium, iron, and essential vitamins in concentrated form. Small daily servings are now used in some regions to support nutrition where food diversity is limited. The data is not hidden, it's published, tested, and widely available. Yet, despite this evidence, Moringa remains underutilized at scale, especially in the very regions where its benefits could have the greatest impact. So what does one Moringa tree actually produce in practical terms? A mature tree can yield hundreds of pods each year, containing thousands of seeds. Those seeds can be pressed for oil, typically producing a few liters annually, depending on climate and care. When processed into biodiesel and blended, even small-scale setups can support basic energy needs like lighting or running a generator. The leaves offer even more consistent value. In warm climates, they can be harvested weekly without damaging the tree. Fresh leaves can be cooked like spinach, while dried leaves can be ground into powder and stored, making them a reliable, low-cost nutritional source for families. And then there's water. A single seed can treat roughly 1 liter of contaminated water using a simple mix and settle method. Individually, these outputs are modest. Together, they form a system that can significantly reduce dependency when used consistently. Now scale that up. A small cluster of trees can support a household. A few dozen can support a community. In regions where land is dry and resources are limited, systems like this can make a measurable difference over time. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently. And yet, today, billions still face challenges tied to the same 3 needs: reliable energy, adequate nutrition, and clean water. Governments and organizations invest heavily in large-scale solutions, power grids, industrial agriculture, and centralized water systems. These approaches can be effective, but they often require significant infrastructure, funding, and long-term maintenance. Moringa doesn't replace those systems. But it offers something different, a low-cost, locally adaptable option that can work alongside them. In many places, that kind of resilience was once common. Over time, it became less visible. And in some regions, it's only now beginning to return. In the past 2 decades, Moringa has started to reappear, but in a very different form. Today, it's often sold as a premium superfood, packaged into powders, capsules, and teas, sometimes at prices far beyond what local communities can afford. The focus is usually on nutrition, vitamins, antioxidants, and wellness trends. But that's only one part of its potential. Its role in water treatment and small-scale energy is rarely discussed in mainstream markets. Not because it lacks value, but because those uses don't fit easily into centralized, high-margin systems. They are local, low-cost, and difficult to standardize at a global commercial scale. Meanwhile, in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, communities continue to use Moringa in practical ways, growing it, harvesting it, and relying on it quietly. The knowledge never fully disappeared. It just moved out of the spotlight. Moringa's story is a reminder that nature often holds solutions far beyond what industries or governments prioritize. One tree can feed a family, purify water, and produce fuel, all without patents, without petroleum, and without ongoing costs. It's abundance in its purest form. Imagine a village with 100 Moringa trees, children never go hungry, water is safe to drink, generators run without imported diesel, and families gain independence from fragile supply chains. This is not a distant dream, it's entirely achievable. And yet, the tree thrives quietly, in ditches, roadsides, and forgotten corners, waiting for those who dare to plant it. Each leaf, each seed, carries a legacy of 4,000 years of human ingenuity, nutrition, and resilience. You can honor that legacy today. Plant one tree, try a seed-based water filter, or support local Moringa initiatives. Subscribe to Forgotten Roots. Every like, share, and comment preserves what was nearly erased and spreads solutions the world desperately needs.